Hello, my name is Tim Gordon, and I'm delighted to be facilitating this brief webinar on the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries' proposed new longevity risk taxonomy. The taxonomy is a general framework for understanding longevity risk and, in particular, all its components. It has been produced by the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries' Mortality Research Steering Committee, or MRSC, which is ably chaired by Sacha Dhamani. We're very lucky to have Sacha here today to take us through the taxonomy and to answer questions on how it helps with understanding and ultimately assessing longevity risk. We're also joined by my erstwhile colleague, Kishore Ananda, who has been helping Sacha and the committee to finalise the framework. We're all longevity specialists. Sacha is head of longevity at Royal London, a UK insurance company. Kishore is a senior global pricing actuary at SCOR, a longevity reinsurer. His current focus is global best estimate assumptions. And on the other side of the fence, to my personal knowledge, Kishore's also run some very large longevity risk transfer transactions. And I'm head of demographic horizons at Aon. Also heavily involved in the subcommittee are Stephen Baxter from Club Vita and Alison Yelland from Canada Life. So without further ado, Sacha, please tell us about the new longevity risk taxonomy.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, so I'm going to give a brief overview of the taxonomy. More details can be found on the website, and I'm going to cover why we think this is needed, what our approach has been to construct the framework, the specific risk components that make up the taxonomy, and then the main benefits of this taxonomy. So, the use of longevity risk taxonomies is relatively widespread in that it's used to, by insurance companies to manage longevity risk, but also as a framework to enable the construction of risk capital models. But often different actuaries will use the same term to mean different parts of longevity risk, or they'll use different terms to mean the same part of longevity risk. And this is often very unhelpful in communication between actuaries and between companies and the regulator, etc., etc. So we think it's helpful to develop a lingua franca that gives everyone a common set of reference terms that we can use to communicate. The analogy I would use is the CMI mortality projections model. Whilst we as actuaries will have our own internal mortality improvement models, we often convert these into a standard calibration of the CMI model, such that for reporting purposes, such that we can compare how we are against the market and allow market analysts to compare companies and see how people are viewing mortality improvement differently. So I'm hopeful that this framework can serve the same purpose. In terms of constructing the framework, we've got probably three principles that we've wanted to follow. We wanted to focus on the sources of risk, how the risk emerges in reality, in terms of particular events or particular areas of assumptions. We want to distinguish between what is the real world and what arises from limitations in either the actuarial model or the company's risk management operations. I'll be very clear about that. We've started with a generic longevity basis structure, which is relatively high level, and that allows us to distinguish between what are population risks and then what are the portfolio risks. And I'm going to go through those briefly now. If I can move the slide on. There we go. Okay, so you can see that we have 10 risk components, and these are designed to cover the full spectrum of longevity risk. It wouldn't necessarily be the case that each company would be materially exposed to all of them, but they're designed to cover all possible approach to longevity and all possible exposure. So quite a wide framework. And as I mentioned, we distinguish between population risks and portfolio risks. Now, I'm not going to go through in detail each of these. There are more details on the website, and I'll encourage you to have a look there. But I'll just call out a couple just to give you a flavour of what we're trying to represent. So, for example, event risk. An example of this would be the introduction of breast cancer screening in 1988. So the adoption of the screening was an event that then changed mortality improvement in the population going forwards. This is sort of different from, say, basis risk on the population in the portfolio, where we take assumptions that are derived from one population, either the reference population or part of the portfolio, and assume it's relevant to another part of the portfolio. And there is a risk that that doesn't actually prove to be the case. So you can see that there are risks which are generic and part of the real world, which should be relatively common, and then there will be risks that are specific to the individual portfolio and how they approach risk management and setting assumptions specifically. In terms of the benefits, we think there are probably two main benefits. We want to we hope this framework will allow us to reduce miscommunication about how people are thinking about longevity risk and what risk they're exposed to. And the other benefit will be, we think this will enable better benchmarking of risks and risk capital, and Kishore's going to talk more about that in a moment. So very high level overview. The paper which outlines the framework in more detail can be found at the link that's on the screen now, and there's ways to get in touch with us if you want to give us some feedback on what you think about that. Okay, Tim, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Sacha. So, thought it would help if we have a few questions, a few specific questions on the framework. So, Kishore, how does the population portfolio distinction made by the framework compared with the base trend distinction still used by a number of companies?
Thanks, Tim. So, whilst there's many approaches to the construction of a generic basis, for the purpose of the framework, we adopted a structure where we start with a reference population, which provides historical and projected mortality rates. We then take those population rates and adjust them so that they're appropriate to the specific lives within the target portfolio. As you can imagine, this differs from the traditional base trend distinction, such that base is not synonymous with portfolio nor trend with population. And I guess just to give an example of that, the uncertainty in the level of, say, future mortality improvements for a specific target portfolio relative to a reference population would traditionally be captured under trend risk, whereas under this framework, this is captured under portfolio basis risk.
Okay, thank you, Kishore. So, Sacha, a thorny issue for many, I know. Is this framework applicable over both, on the one hand, runoff/economic horizons, but also a one-year time horizon?
Yeah, absolutely. So by focusing on the sources of risk, it's naturally designed from an economic or a runoff perspective, and what risk will emerge over the full duration of the liabilities. But we've been quite careful to sort of look at how that will be applied in a one-off. We've not really focused on the modelling, but one of the things the paper talks about in quite a bit of detail is how those sources of risk might emerge over a 1 year, such that it can be applied in a 1 year time horizon, which is often very relevant for actuaries in the risk capital space.
That's certainly true. Kishore, I'm curious, what is the difference between classification and heterogeneity risk in the framework?
Thanks, Tim. So under the framework, we've defined classification risk as the risk that a given life is misallocated to a specific group within a basis, and therefore the resulting assumptions applied are not appropriate to the life in question. Now, this can occur when information used to allocate a given life to a given group has actually grown stale, whereas heterogeneity risk relates to within group risk. So this occurs when the individual life is actually allocated to the correct group, but the group in question still exhibits considerable mortality variability within it. And I guess a really good example of that is when an open-ended pension band is used, resulting in very diverse lives from a mortality perspective being allocated to the same group.
Thank you. So, Sacha, big question. Should this framework be adopted by all insurance companies for their internal Solvency II models?
Yeah, I mean, that is a really good question. I can imagine that sort of people looking at this framework would wonder whether that would be the case. No, I don't think they would necessarily. I think different companies will have different risk exposure and different views on risk, and their own particular risk taxonomy should reflect the exposure. You know, so for example, what a specific company will find is the materiality of, say, some of the risk components in the longevity framework we've constructed are different. So some will be quite big, some might be relatively material, and you wouldn't necessarily want to have a surplus of risk components that will overcomplicate your modelling. So no, we would not expect everyone to sort of adopt this. We're not sort of suggesting this should be the one framework which all companies should converge to. Having said that, when assessing your own framework, this our sources of risk should be sort of relevant and present in terms of whether they're there. Do you cover it, or they're not relevant to you? And also, if a company is building a new model from scratch, this would serve as a good starting point for which to build that model. But no, we're not seeking to or saying that this should be the framework everyone uses and encourage any kind of convergence. That wouldn't be appropriate.
Brilliant. Okay, that's very clear. So, Kishore, I'm interested. Can you take us through the next steps?
Thanks, Tim. So yes, just wait for the slide to come across. Great. So phase one of the work is now drawing to a close. So the Longevity Risk Framework has been published for consultation, and the consultation period will be ending on 31 March. As Sacha mentioned, we appreciate the feedback that we've received, but encourage others to also share the feedback in the coming weeks if they haven't done so already. Once the consultation period ends, we'll be using April to update the framework in light of the feedback we've received, with a view to publishing the final document at the end of April. And then moving on to phase two of the work, which actually has already kicked off and running in parallel, which we expect to run through the remainder of the year. Now, this work will focus on the development of a benchmarking methodology to enable the mapping of user-defined risk frameworks to the IFoA framework and vice versa. A critical part of this is we're working very hard to ensure that the benchmarking methodology is flexible enough to allow users to either adopt a top-down or a bottom-up approach when mapping frameworks. Once we have an initial draft, we'll be engaging with industry volunteers to test the benchmarking methodology. So if there's anybody out there who's interested in participating, please get in touch. And the final stage of this phase will involve working with the volunteers to further develop the methodology and the associated analysis to prepare and roll out a survey to the wider industry, and B, analyze the subsequent survey results and present the findings back to the profession. So
excellent. Well, thank you, Kishore, and thank you both for taking us through the new taxonomy, and thank you for explaining the benefits of using the taxonomy in practice. As Kishore mentioned, the MRC is looking for volunteer companies to test the draft benchmarking methodology. So please let us know if you're interested in participating. If you are, please follow the link on the screen. And finally, thank you for listening. Cheerio.